To better understand how knowledge translation is related to transinclusive abortion services, an interview was conducted with representatives from the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada. The ARCC is a grassroots advocacy organization dedicated to supporting abortion rights and access from a transinclusive perspective. We talked to Joyce Arthur, the Executive Director, and AJ Lowick, Board Member and Researcher, to learn from their perspectives about the topic.
Joyce Arthur, and I'm the Executive Director of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the founder of ARC. We've been around since 2005. And I'm in Vancouver, so I'm talking to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.
And I'm AJ Lowick. I use they, them, their pronouns. I'm just a few months away from finishing my PhD in trans studies. And I am a trans reproductive health researcher. So if it has anything to do with trans reproductive life, health, decision-making, that's where I feel most at home. And I'm also in Vancouver along with Joyce, so on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples.
Great, thank you. So to start, we would like to know a bit more about the organization and your role within the organization.
Okay, I guess I can start and AJ can jump in as well. As I mentioned, the organization Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada was founded in 2005. And I founded it with the help of a network of people across Canada. So we're a grassroots advocacy organization, and we support and defend abortion rights and work to improve access as well. So we have the board of directors across Canada, and we have about 450 members. And we're kind of a small group, but I think I'd like to say that we punch above our weight. We do a lot of political lobbying work, fighting against anti-choice restrictions and laws and misinformation, and all kinds of other campaigns and communications. And we're a virtual organization, so I'm speaking to you from the ARC's official office, my home. So we save a lot of money that way and make good use of our shoestring budget.
And I joined the board of directors of ARC in January of 2021 at Joyce's invitation. I had long since heard of and respected ARC's work as a kind of independent abortion activist and someone who worked in abortion settings and thought a lot about trans people in abortion care. And so Joyce invited me to the board just at the beginning of this year.
Great, thank you. This is a bit of a broad question, but we would like to know more about the process of the coalition to introduce practices that are more inclusive to trans and gender diverse communities.
Sure, okay. Obviously we started out, as an abortion rights organization before I think transgender rights were really much on the horizon. And so it was a bit of a journey for us. And I should say for me as well, like I'm an older person, I'm kind of old school feminist. I still have friends who are, disagree with me on this issue. But what happened was, I think there was another group in Canada called the Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights, another pro-choice group. And also, I should mention that this issue of transgender rights and inclusivity is kind of tied, at least for us, with the rights of sex workers. So what happened was that Action Canada initially published a statement in support of sex workers on their website. I think this was back in 2014. And we reposted this on our Facebook and with a supportive comment. And then what happened was this, I call it a SWERP swarm. SWERP is an acronym that means that sex work exclusionary radical feminists. And you may also be familiar with the term TERF, which is transgender exclusionary radical feminists. So there's a lot of overlap between those two groups. And for us, those issues became kind of entwined. At the time, I was working on position papers. ARC was going to come out in support of sex worker rights and transgender rights. And so we published these papers together in tandem. And I was a little bit nervous about, what the fallback might be. And as it turned out, there was virtually none. It was very well received, so that was a huge relief. But there was one or two members that got upset with us. One member resigned and even wrote a letter to the board of directors complaining about it, mostly about the sex worker issue, but she also threw in there, well, I think, this transgender issue, we still have to deal with, who is really a woman, and this day is not over yet. And so issues like that, right? But to my surprise, it was very well received. And even, I think there was one or two members who sort of were a little bit uncertain at first, but respected ARC enough to respect our position on it and come along with us. So I was so happy that we did that, because it's really made a huge difference, and it feels great being respectful of transgender rights. And there's a lot of people, for example, on our social media who are so thankful that we are trans inclusive. Our social media, I think, is a really good example of that.
Yeah, and meanwhile, I was just starting my own investigation of trans-inclusive abortion and what that could look like and what the barriers were. And I was digging through literature and finding nothing. No one was talking about this issue. And then like a beacon in the dark was this position paper by ARC that had the words transgender and abortion right in it. And I was like, okay, this is on someone's horizon that, that trans folks need abortion too. And that, this is something we ought to be talking about. And that's when I first heard of ARC and kind of knew that there were people out there who were thinking about trans-inclusive abortion. And eventually, over the period of the next 6 years, I would find my way to ARC as a board member.
Great. So bringing AJ to the team was also part of this process, I imagine.
Yes, we went through kind of a board renewal process last year because our numbers were depleting. People had left for various personal reasons. So we thought we want to become more diverse, because up to that point we were mostly just a bunch of white women, although there were a couple of LGBT members amongst us. But so we just bandied names about and did some research. And actually, it wasn't me that suggested you, AJ. It was our previous treasurer. And I thought, yeah, right, AJ, yeah, of course, it'd be perfect. And so we were so happy to bring AJ along, and we've got a few other diverse board members as well. And so it's a great board, really active, and I think there was a second part to the question about how in the years since 2015, when we published our papers, how we incorporated the trans inclusivity into our work. And I think primarily it's a lot of just making sure that it's kind of part of every issue when we talk about it, when we write a paper or talk to the media or post on social media. That issue is always there. We're always recognizing as transgender people and rights and their issues as well. Using the trans-inclusive language, which doesn't necessarily mean letting go of the word woman, but including both, because there's room for everyone's rights, and then just making sure that I think thinking about our projects too, and under the umbrella of reproductive justice, which includes, of course, transgender rights and many other issues, and trying to broaden our campaign work to focus not just on abortion rights, but sexual and reproductive health rights in general. So all that brings transgender people under the umbrella as well. And so we always try and make people aware of that. When we talk to the media, make a point of mentioning transgender rights, and you see that reflected more and more in media stories as well, which I think is really important. Because often I think that the general culture and society around us is still a bit behind us in terms of transgender rights, so we have to educate them. So we're doing our best to model things. Probably, at least in the early years, we were doing more of that than maybe actual projects. But now I think, especially with AJ on board, we're getting more involved in projects and campaigns that more broadly reflect reproductive justice.
Great. Yeah. And you talked a bit about the backlash you received with the initial position. Has there been more backlash or challenges like resistance within the abortion rights area or field currently? Like, how do you handle that?
There's really been none that I can think of. As I mentioned, sometimes there's a bit of backlash now and then to our position on sex worker rights. We've received nothing but positive responses from our position on transgender rights. So I'm just really happy that we've gone there and embraced it. It's been very, very positive.
Yeah, and I, as part of my consulting business, I work with abortion providers to think through inclusive policy and practice. But I really only go where I'm invited, and I'm invited quite a lot, actually. And every once in a while, there'll be someone in a training who finds some of my recommendations challenging. So, using the language for someone's body parts that they use to refer to their own body parts. Occasionally folks are like, that feels awkward to me, or I'm not sure isn't that objectifying? And there's kind of a discussion to be had about some of the recommendations that I make for ensuring spaces and services are inclusive. But I have very rarely encountered kind of hostility or even hesitation to in theory, do the work of including trans people. People can get on board, and then how to do that might have some sticking points, but the idea that trans people ought to have access to inclusive abortion services for everyone that I've encountered is kind of like, is taken as truth. And then how to do that might kind of have some complexity to it, but getting people to recognize that trans folks need access to abortion services, at least now, 10 years ago, it was maybe a little more challenging. Doesn't seem to be where the stumbling block is.
Now, I could just add to that. I also do some global work in terms of like running listservs and some social media. And so I'm dealing with, other pro-choice people, providers and advocates around the world. And I think Canada and I guess the US too, I see them as like far ahead of many other parts of the world, including even the UK. And I've even had people making a comment like, what do you mean that other people besides women getting pregnant? Like, they haven't even heard of this concept before, and you have to explain it to them.
Yeah, and actually talking about this catching up, it links a bit with the next question, which is we would like to get your perspective about what do you think are the biggest challenges that are affecting the knowledge translation process related to abortion care access?
I mean, I think the very first one that comes to mind is that you need knowledge in order to translate knowledge, and we simply don't have a good evidence base. So to my knowledge at the moment, there are less than 10 peer-reviewed research articles that look at trans people's experiences of and access to abortion services, and they all come from the United States. And so there is no Canadian trans abortion data. And we can and should take data from kind of peripheral areas. So perinatal care, we've got a little bit that's happening about pregnancy and childbirth. We've got some kind of growing critical menstruation studies about trans people, kind of peripherally related topics that we can and should use to inform our policy and practice in the abortion sector. But when it comes to very specific knowledge about trans people and abortion, we have virtually nothing. And so in order to translate knowledge, you need knowledge. And so we need to, I think, first and foremost, implore upon researchers the necessity of ensuring that their research is inclusive to trans people. And that doesn't mean just doing a trans-specific research study necessarily, but if you're studying abortion, the study ought to be meaningfully inclusive of people who don't identify as women, so that we start to build a knowledge base from which we can do these kind of knowledge translation activities.
Yeah. And what are some of the specific areas that you feel like are more lacking in this in terms of evidence-based?
I mean, virtually everything. Because if you consider, for example, that if you type in abortion into a research search engine, you're going to generate tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of peer-reviewed journal articles about this topic. Whereas if you add the word trans, you're looking at a handful, literally 5 to 10. And so what we know about trans people and abortion is literally a drop in a bucket. There's a few articles that are about self-managed abortion, some that are about perceptions of abortion, and I think one or two that are about, experiences accessing abortion. But in the grand scheme of things, those are research studies that have been conducted with very small samples in very localized spaces that are not necessarily generalizable. We need to continue to ask these questions. We need to think about the way that transphobia and abortion stigma intersect, for example. We need to think about, in the Canadian context, how trans people are accessing abortion services. Are we going for aspiration abortion or medication abortion? Why? What's informing that decision? How are trans people in Canada navigating abortion as women-centered space? Is that creating barriers and obstacles? Like, for me as a researcher, the amount of questions to be asked is a football field long. Like, there's just so much we don't know. Because really, if we kind of consider 5 to 10 articles in the English-speaking literature, that virtually tells us that we know nothing.
As a follow-up, how would addressing the issue of a lack of evidence-based knowledge impact service usage among trans and gender diverse communities?
Yeah, so I mean, medical spaces really love an evidence-based best practice. And so without the evidence, the best practice can't be informed by that evidence. nevertheless, we can kind of extrapolate and make recommendations for policy and practice based on, as I said, these kind of tangentially related reproductive healthcare spaces. And that's very much what I do. We can also take what's called anecdotal evidence. So people's lived experiences that maybe haven't been recorded in peer-reviewed journal articles, but nevertheless circulate on the internet and forums and on Facebook and those types of places to see what's happening for trans people when they try to access abortion service. Ultimately, the barriers that trans people experience in abortion settings are all those that they would experience in other kind of women-centered reproductive healthcare spaces. So that's everything from the design of the waiting room and what magazines are available for you to read, to the intake form, the availability of neutral or inclusive washroom spaces, the language that's used to talk to you about sexual health, about pregnancy prevention, both in terms of like safer sex practices and body parts, the pamphlet that you're given with information for, you know, referrals into community or tangentially related topics that you might need like support access for. Everything, all of those spaces are opportunities for improvement. And we know these to be true even without evidence. I know these to be true as a trans person who has worked in abortion spaces, and I bring that knowledge with me when I teach providers. Having the evidence would just allow me, for example, when I'm talking to folks, to have something to kind of back me up, as it were. I'm going to suggest policy and practice recommendations even without, you know, this kind of gold standard of evidence coming from the peer review sector, because having worked in abortion care spaces, I know what the barriers are. But yeah, having that evidence to back up the policy and practice recommendations that I make would kind of add a bit of weight to what I'm saying to folks.
For sure.
Add to that, I think there was a survey done in Ontario some years back at the Transgender Health, Sexual Health Survey. And I mean, what AJ was saying is so true. Like, if there's these barriers in place, and they might be totally unintentional in terms of the language and the literature and so on, it can intimidate. Like, let's say a person is a trans man or a non-binary person, they might decide to present as a woman when they go to the clinic, so that they're not going to be asked all these questions and have to explain themselves and everything. So it's coming out of fear, and it can also stop transgender people from accessing healthcare at all, or delay their care, right? So these are some of the outcomes that can happen if you don't have a trans-inclusive space. So it's really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, for those who are able to kind of conceal their trans identity and thus not disclose that they're trans, that the consequence of that at the institutional level is this continuation of erasure, where providers will say, well, we've never seen trans people here. And it's like, well, that you know of, that disclosed to you that they were trans. There's this kind of idea that, like, you can tell when someone is trans. And that's certainly true of some folks who are very visible in their identities and expressions. But yeah, for many folks, the act of identity concealment is actually a strategy going into these spaces, because they anticipate that being outwardly, visibly, identifiably trans will result in suboptimal care, and everything from, you know, persistent misgendering to outright transphobia, denial of care, being asked to leave the space, all of these kinds of things. And these anticipated fears, as Joyce was saying, anticipating that something is going to go wrong, for many people will result in them not going to seek out that care in the first place. And for abortion access, which is incredibly time sensitive, and for many a matter of like good mental health outcomes, that it's absolutely necessary that they have access to abortion, delaying or foregoing care has really dire consequences.
So how does the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada go about addressing these issues in your advocacy work?
Well, as I mentioned before, we try and, you know, model the language and always be inclusive of transgender rights and their issues. And I just think in terms of our, as I mentioned, that we try and incorporate it into our projects and campaigns more and more in our language, even to, for example, members of parliament. I mean, it can be challenging sometimes. There was a recent bill in Parliament that was an anti-choice bill that was trying to criminalize sex selection abortion. So it can be a bit difficult sometimes to be completely trans inclusive when talking about that particular issue. But you can still do it. There's ways to do it, and it's really important to always keep that in mind. And just and I think just by doing these practices and modeling the language and everything, it reflects back on others and they learn as well. And we see that even sometimes by members of parliament and parliament recognizing transgender rights. I think so. I guess I see ARC as like setting an example more than anything, and hoping that we can bring the culture along with us.
And ARC does release these little kind of information postcards that are translated into a variety of languages that just let folks know that abortion is available in Canada, what that service looks like, the kind of gestational limits for abortion. And as I said, those have been translated, I think now into more than half a dozen languages. And each of those is written with a statement about the fact that trans people need access to abortion care as well. And so folks who are speaking English as additional language, who need translated documents, are not exempt from this trans-inclusive language and lesson, as it were. So just ensuring that anyone who kind of accesses ARC's resources is hearing that message of inclusivity across kind of language needs as well.
Which brings to mind the fact that sometimes when you're translating into other languages, it can be a challenge to be gender inclusive. So we sort of dealt with that issue in French and figured out a way to be inclusive in how we use the adjectives and nouns. And I know a couple of the translators, I think it was Urdu and one or two other languages, it was a bit of a challenge for them to sort of get across the transgender issues. But I think we succeeded. We made a point of telling the translators this issue is very important to us. We want to reflect inclusive language.
Awesome. I'm just thinking about, AG, maybe you can talk a little bit about your consulting work and how you go about addressing some of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in that case, it might help to kind of start at the beginning of the story, as it were, which is that for me, between 13 and 10 years ago, I was working in an abortion clinic that was a women's only abortion clinic, and yet was more and more not identifying as woman personally, which kind of put me at odds with the employment policy of the place that I worked. And I started asking questions of my colleagues about how many trans people have you served? Some of these folks had been working in abortion care for 20 years. How would your service provision change if you knew that your patient was trans? And I was met with a lot of confusion, folks who either didn't imagine that trans people would need access to abortion because their understanding of transness was that a trans person wouldn't use their body for sexual reasons, let alone reproductive reasons, so they would never find themselves in need of abortion access. Or kind of not able to think through the barriers beyond, say, names and pronouns. They knew that using someone's correct name and using someone's correct pronouns was a part of it, but beyond that, they couldn't really think through the other potential barriers or changes to their service provision. I ultimately left that work place to do a master's degree in sociology, where I thought about what I called a corporeal trans feminism. So a trans inclusive feminism that took the body into account. Because what I was witnessing was a lot of people saying trans women should be included into women's spaces, which of course they should, and that trans men should be included into men's spaces. And I was saying, well, but some of these spaces, these women's spaces, serve the body. And actually, if we only have an identity-based inclusion policy, we're going to leave out the corporeal or body-based needs of some people, that actually we need to think beyond just including more women under the silo of women and more men under the silo of men. And we need to think about what service is actually being offered in that space and who could benefit from it, regardless of their identity. So I wrote this as my master's thesis, and then I kind of left the topic of abortion for a while, until La Fédération du Planning de Naissance, which is kind of like the Planned Parenthood in Quebec, found the title of my master's thesis. They were looking for trans-inclusive abortion thinking and work, and they came to me and said, do you have any materials for our abortion providers about how to do this? And I said, no, they don't exist, but I could write you one. And so I ended up writing a trans-inclusive abortion service manual in consultation with a variety of folks. There were lots of people kind of on board, but ultimately I kind of first authored this resource, and we produced it in Quebec, translated it into French, so it was available in both languages. And then it slowly became something that was adapted across Canada, and other provinces and territories picked it up as a resource that they wanted to think about in their own space. It's since been adapted for use in the United States, and I'm actually just finalizing a Spanish language translated version that's been adapted for use in Argentina with some colleagues of mine there who are at the forefront of the abortion rights movement in Argentina. And I use that manual in my training. So essentially the manual was kind of a guiding document for my own learning to think through like all of the various places where these barriers might exist and how can we strategize solution to those barriers. And so it's very much the kind of, it's the backbone of what I do when I go and I talk to abortion providers in person or virtually in the time of COVID, is I have an in-person training. We talk through and strategize solution to barriers. And then I use this manual as like, if you have unanswered questions, here's where you potentially can find them.
So in your opinion, what is the best way to bridge gaps between community knowledge, academic research, and advocacy in this context? And maybe I'll just clarify what I mean about community knowledge. Is kind of what AJ, you touched on before, on like you as a trans person are aware of the gaps, are aware of the issues that exist, but that's not really recognized as valid knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question that exceeds the discussion of trans-inclusive abortion, that just is how we value certain kinds of knowledge, both within academia and outside of academia. So like government policy depends on expert testimonial. Well, who counts as expert for the purposes of giving testimony? The kind of valuing of knowledge that has been filtered through a researcher. Well, who gets access to the role of researcher? It's, definitely along the axes of like whiteness and cisness and, ability and those types of things. So the question, I think, is how can we destabilize an entire system that values this kind of institutional academic knowledge, scholarly knowledge, over the lived experiences of people whose lives and stories only become data when they're filtered through a research mechanism, which is like inherently exploitative. So I guess the short answer would be believe people when they tell you what their experiences are, even if those experiences haven't been filtered through a research mechanism. That if, a patient comes to you or a colleague comes to you and tells you about something that happened to them in, for example, the abortion sector, that you believe that that is their truth and that happened to them, and then you work to rectify it with policy and practice, as opposed to waiting for the evidence. Because if we just wait for the evidence, then we're going to be even further behind.
I really want to second that. What AJ said is really important, and it made me think again of the sex worker rights issue and the parallels. There's a saying in the sex worker rights community, nothing about us without us. And so it's true, there's lots of research, valid research about sex worker rights, but it's experiential knowledge and their lived experience, which is just as essential, just as important in terms of the evidence, right? So we're talking about knowledge transfer. It's not just the academic side, but it's also the real lived knowledge that comes from these communities. So I would say the exact same thing goes for the transgender rights communities. And knowledge transfer can be very broad, and we kind of use it ourselves by default without even really thinking about it. Whenever we write a position paper, we're summarizing the evidence, but also talking about the lived experience of trans people. And when we wrote our transgender inclusivity paper a few years ago, we did get input from several transgender individuals and groups, and as well as looking at the resource that was available mostly in the US. And so we did that ourselves. And at the time, I didn't know what the term knowledge transfer was, but here I was doing it. So there's all kinds of ways, all kinds of different valid knowledge to translate in many different ways to do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're wondering if ARC collaborates with policymakers or does any sort of policy advocacy.
Other than what I mentioned before, I don't know, I can't think of any really specific examples, other than when we do talk to policymakers about whatever issue it is, we just make sure to acknowledge and talk about transgender issues as well, so that they understand that. So it's just a matter of sort of, moving the needle and moving the culture closer. But I'm hoping with AJ's help, and we've got a couple of committees going at ARC, we can implement more projects. Like one example is we want to start a speaker series bring in speakers, and maybe just do it over Zoom and invite people. And maybe one of the first ones we'll do is on transgender inclusivity, and AJ will be our first speaker.
Amazing. So what would be your recommendations for policymakers or advocacy groups and researchers who are trying to do similar work in addressing trans access to abortion?
I mean, I think I would recommend not taking the lack of peer-reviewed scholarly evidence as an excuse to not be inclusive in your language. So like erasure begets erasure. And so just because the evidence base is lacking doesn't justify not using inclusive language in your policy and practice, because the evidence will catch up to what we know experientially, like in our communities and in our bodies, as being a need. And one of the things that I see happening is folks saying like, oh, well, if there isn't evidence, well, then I don't have anything on which to base my policy or practice. But that ultimately kind of just perpetuates the cycle of erasure. And instead, I would say kind of how Joyce and ARC have done is to actually model inclusivity, because then the impetus is placed on researchers, on scholars, on policymakers and lawmakers and clinicians and all kinds of folks to ensure that their practice aligns with the inclusivity of the language that's being used. And it kind of reveals to folks for whom this very idea is new that actually people at all levels are thinking in inclusive ways, and that it behooves us to catch up to that. And so, yeah, that would be my primary recommendation, is to acknowledge how erasure begets erasure, and to intervene on that at whatever stage you are at and whatever role you take. And so if you're a clinician, do something about the way that you're delivering service. If you're a policymaker, do something in the way about the way that you talk about abortion as an issue, so that you're not just using the language of women's rights. You're using inclusive and maybe inclusive additive language of like women, trans and non-binary people and others who access abortion, or you're using inclusive neutral language of like anyone who needs abortion services, because that inclusive language at the level of policy will then trickle into better evidence, better research. And so, yeah, I think there's opportunities for improvement wherever we're working on this issue.
And the same goes for ARC too. And I just wanted to mention this. I haven't mentioned this to anyone yet, so this is a new idea I'm just floating. But ARC has a broadly used list of abortion clinics and abortion facilities across Canada, where people can look up and find a place in their region to go to. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if we could put as part of each listing whether they're a trans-friendly space? Mm-hmm. And some of them are, but others we don't know. But it could serve as an encouragement for other clinics to be more aware of it. And they look at our list and say, oh, it's not listed there that we are a trans-friendly space, but we are. So send an email to Joyce and get our listing edited. And I could even, email the clinics across Canada asking them about this, and that's sort of a give them a jump in order to start thinking about the issue and want to be included on our list of the trans-friendly space. So I don't know if you like that idea, AJ, but I think it might be worth trying.
I do like that idea. Yeah, it reminds me of a similar process that a group of us are undertaking in BC here we're creating a resource called Mind Map, which is essentially a database of mental health providers that are LGBTQ affirming. And it raises the question of like, what counts as affirming? Is it self-selected? Is me telling you that I'm trans affirming enough? Or are there certain criteria? What are those criteria? How do we assess those criteria? So I love the idea, Joyce, and I think we can build on it.
Because the big question about knowledge translation that I'm getting here is like, how to even translate knowledge that we don't have, right? So just hearing about this, maybe like motivating this kind of loop, like putting it out there and just expecting that it will then create more evidence. And just wanted to get briefly your perspective of because the concept of evidence analogously with the concept of experts, right? What is evidence-based knowledge in this sense? So I don't know if any of you have some ideas of also what type of knowledge is needed in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I might be. I absolutely am biased, and I would argue that knowledge produced by trans people about trans issues is first and foremost. And so that is not to discourage cis researchers from doing inclusive research. We need you too. But knowledge that is generated by trans people in community with one another, I think is particularly impactful because then it is translated through the lens of researchers who are themselves members of the community. And then we don't have to do that additional translating of trying to explain our transness to a cis researcher or to a cis interviewer. So having trans folks at the forefront of this kind of movement to me is of fundamental importance. And then just as you were asking your question, Natalia, I was thinking too about the kind of critiques I have of policy. So I think one of the things that happens, policy and best practice, anything that gets kind of written down and claimed to be best or claimed to be evidence-based has a tendency to fix it in place as though we've done it, we've achieved it, we now have the best practice that we could have. Something has now achieved the threshold of policy, therefore it is, it's achieved primacy and like is unquestionable. But ultimately, even right now, things that we call evidence-based practice only serve certain people. So kind of always understanding that our policies and practices ought to be flexible and adaptive and not standardized such that we think we can treat everyone the same according to some written prescription, because the result is going to be that folks of color, Indigenous people, disabled people, poor people, trans people, etc., are actually never going to see themselves reflected in those, even if we have good evidence. Because the kind of nature of policy work is to fix something in place and time and then check a box and say you've done it. And a best practice policy that you write today, even if it's informed by evidence broadly defined, 5 years from now, 2 years from now, tomorrow, is actually going to be obsolete. And so can we, instead of fixing something as, well, it's a policy, can we see actually the potential violences done in the name of policy and in the name of practice, and kind of think about intention less than I followed the letter of what this policy says and prescribes me to do.
I don't know if Joyce also has something to add about this.
Well, just that, yes, definitely like making your policies and your statements flexible. I mentioned we have our position paper on transgender inclusivity, and we have about 70 or so other papers on various aspects of abortion rights and reproductive rights. So I do find that we have to go through and revise them every few years. And in fact, we have revised the transgender paper recently in the last year with new research, and just to sort of make it more, like some of the statements I found after a few years were a little bit off and I had to fix them. So yeah, it's very important to sort of think about that and update your views, and because you're always learning and things are always changing and the language changes too. So it's important to sort of keep up with things.
Yeah, just that iterative practice of, trans inclusivity is not something you can learn in a single training where you can say like, oh, I took that training with AJ, I get to check the box, my staff is trans inclusive now. And similarly, if you develop even something like an anti-discrimination policy for your workplace that has something about, misgendering or transphobia or those types of things in it, it's never a one and done. And the same, I think, with knowledge translation. It's this kind of iterative loop of, thinking about your policy and practice, going back to the evidence, acknowledging the gaps in the evidence and trying to rectify those and bringing that back into the policy and practice, and kind of this constant movement where the work is never done. You're never going to get to a place where you have the best policy, the best practice, the definitive statement on inclusivity, for example. And to suggest that you do is to kind of miss the mark, I think. And so can we encourage this like constant returning to the evidence, fixing the gaps in that evidence, valuing experiential and so-called anecdotal knowledge, the lived experiences of people that never rise to the threshold of evidence in the academy, and then going back to our policy and listening to our patients or our clients and saying, okay, how did you actually experience our space? Because that's much more important than how you theoretically should have experienced our space based on this policy that I wrote. So having those feedback mechanisms from patients or clients and actually taking what they say to heart, as opposed to just going, well, we have a policy that says that shouldn't have happened. irrelevant if it did happen. So yeah, having that kind of flexibility and reflexivity built in, I think, is of really fundamental importance.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for coming to talk with us this morning or afternoon. Do you have anything else you would like to add or any other closing thoughts?
There was actually a project that I forgot to mention where we are incorporating transgender issues, and that's a project to look at, a research project to look at refusals of treatment by doctors. It's called like conscientious objection, where they have an objection due to their personal beliefs or religious beliefs. And usually it often happens for abortion care or birth control, but it also happens in medical assistance in dying and in transgender care as well. So we were hoping to do a project that would kind of look at the incidence of that amongst people, and not just for abortion and birth control, but also transgender healthcare and medical assistance in dying. So that's one way that we're trying to more broadly incorporate transgender rights in ARC's work.
Yeah, and I think my final concluding thought would be, and Joyce alluded to this earlier, that abortion access is one piece of a reproductive justice puzzle. And reproductive justice, if we understand it really broadly, is inclusive of so many issues and communities that maybe at first blush might not seem evident. But things like ensuring that trans women are free from violence so that they can live long enough to make decisions about whether they want to be parents. That is a reproductive justice issue. And so eradicating violence against, trans women of color, in particular trans women of color who engage in survival sex work, that is a reproductive justice issue. And so just kind of encouraging folks to think about abortion as a component of this broader movement towards reproductive justice for all, which is necessarily a movement that needs to consider trans, non-binary, and other non-cisgender identified people.
Great, really interesting talking to you both. So I really want to thank you for your time.